One light, two lights, three lights, four lights, five lights, and it's go, 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 go!
Hello and welcome everyone to a brand new episode of the 5 Red Lights. My name is Aaron, I am your host, and today we are looking back on a absolutely bonkers Hungarian Grand Prix. Where do we start? Well, of course, we start by congratulating Esteban Ocon on his maiden Grand Prix victory. I said to you last week that it was a place for maiden wins, and I actually had Carlos Sainz kind of in mind, thinking the Ferrari would be strong. The Ferrari was strong, but it was Esteban who played the cards correctly and got himself to the front of the order. What a mad opening to the race that set it up as well. But congratulations to Esteban. He lasted the entire course of the race with a 4-time world champion and 53-time Grand Prix winner in Sebastian Vettel directly behind him, putting the pressure on lap after lap after lap, and he held up. He proved everybody that he has got what it takes to be successful as a Formula 1 driver. Unfortunately for Mercedes, or maybe fortunately because they've got George Russell waiting in the wings, he has signed a 3-year deal with Alpine, and of course he's been through a little bit of a tricky run recently. He had a run of 4 or 5 races where he didn't score any points. He picked up some points at Silverstone, and he was looking a little bit stronger this weekend, qualifying in P8, and he did the business on the race day. He got himself in the position, and considering how difficult it is to pass at the Hungaroring, he did everything perfectly. He kept Sebastian Vettel directly behind him, and he got to the flag first. So well done, Esteban. Brilliant, brilliant job. Let's have a look at the rest of the weekend. And let's start our look back at the rest of the weekend with the 60-second race recap. After taking pole position, Lewis Hamilton led a wet start, but Valtteri Bottas took out himself, Lando Norris and Sergio Perez at turn 1. Verstappen picked up damage while Stroll took out Leclerc. There's a second red flag in as many races, and it left Hamilton leading Ocon, Vettel, Tsunoda and Sainz. At the restart, the track had dried for everyone except Hamilton to take the restart from the standing start. So the bizarre images of one car taking the start as everybody poured into the pit lane. Hamilton boxed at the end of lap 4, handing the lead to Esteban Ocon, and he led over Sebastian Vettel, a lead that he would never lose. Hamilton fought back through the traffic, undercutting Verstappen, who was also well down the order considering his damage. Sainz was orchestrating the Ferrari strategy from P5 as Latifi ran third and allowed Ocon and Vettel to pull ahead. Everybody stopped once for mediums to hards, but Hamilton boxed again on lap 48 and returned in 5th place. He closed in rapidly on the 4th place Fernando Alonso, and Fernando battled like his life depended on it. He held up Hamilton long enough to save his teammate and the victory. Ocon held off Vettel all the way to the flag to clinch an incredible maiden Grand Prix win, joining Jenson Button, Fernando Alonso and Damon Hill in taking their first win at Budapest. Hamilton passed Sainz for P3, who hung on for 4th place, while Alonso came in P5. He was followed by Gasly, Tsunoda, Latifi, Russell and Verstappen. So there you have the rundown, a quick rundown of an incredible race. But one of the highlights, apart from the start, which we'll talk about in a few moments, was the battle between Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. This is a battle that we pretty much want to see every race weekend because it's two greats of the sport, two world champions who are brilliantly adaptable in wheel-to-wheel combat. And we saw just how good Fernando is, even though he doesn't really have a car that can fight the Mercedes. And given the way things played out, you would have been forgiven for thinking that Fernando was just the first one for Hamilton to pass on his way to victory. But Fernando actually had the youngest tyres of the top 4 that Hamilton was trying to overtake. And he didn't make it easy for Lewis. This is the Fernando who wants to prove that he's still got it, even at 40 years old. This is the Fernando that wants to show Alpine that if they deliver a winning car in 2022, he's their man. And regardless of Ocon winning the race, Alonso will still think he is the man to win the World Championship in 22, should Alpine provide the equipment. But what it did do was, as well as save the victory for Esteban, was provide us viewers and fans with racing that we are begging for. We were salivating over it. It was absolutely incredible, and it was a masterclass of defensive driving from Fernando, positioning his car perfectly at every single point. And in fact, the only reason Hamilton got past was because the pair of them started to close on Sainz, and at turn 1 I think Alonso locked up because of the dirty air from the Ferrari, and that meant he ran wide, and Hamilton then got a really, really good run on him. But apart from that, Hamilton was not coming by. And you know, Alonso has history with Hamilton, and they've gone wheel to wheel before. Remember back to Mexico in 2017, but also remember back to when they were teammates at McLaren in 2007, Indianapolis, the last race F1 held there at the Brickyard. And this was Hamilton's first season, of course, a week after his maiden victory, and Alonso tried to intimidate him by going wheel to wheel down the main straight. Hamilton didn't put a foot wrong. And of course, this is a very different Hamilton and a very different Alonso, some 13 years on. But they still gave each other that racing room and respect, but they were oh so close, and they even touched on the way to turn 4. Lewis did find a way past, and he did get into an eventual 3rd place. But it was fantastic action, and considering this is a track that you can't overtake on very easily, these two provided such brilliant action. And of course it was one faster car trying to overtake a slower car by some margin, but still it was great racing. And the Hungaroring should not be labelled as a track where you can't race. The opening sequence of corners, if you get it right out of the final corner, you give yourself a really good chance, maybe not into turn 1, but perhaps definitely into turn 2. And turn 4, Hamilton showed as well that you can do it. You need some balls, and you need a compliant person on the inside, but it's doable. Fantastic racing, brilliant from Fernando, amazing action, and one of the absolute highlights of not just this race, of the season so far. Now let's also touch on the opening to the race with Valtteri Bottas triggering a multi-car collision. Now obviously Red Bull will not be pleased, because that's a second race in a row where one, at least, of their drivers has been taken out of the race on lap 1. And I know Christian Horner is a little bit salty about it, but get over it, mate. This is racing. Bottas did not do it on purpose. Anyone who thinks that Bottas did that on purpose needs to have a quick look at just how good these drivers are and how dangerous this sport can be, because driving into the back of another car is inherently dangerous, and we've seen it go wrong. We've seen accidents happen, not because someone was trying to do it on purpose, but accidents happen, and at a wet start these sort of things happen. And to be honest, when it is a wet start, these things should happen all the time, because it's so difficult to get temperature into the brakes, especially when it's wet, and they run down into turn 1, and of course you have to take into account the conditions as a driver, but let's look at the situation here. This is a wet start. Bottas is already on the back foot. He's been sort of pinched and sandwiched by the Red Bull and the McLaren coming past him. The dirty air effect, even though it would be low at that speed, it's still a big factor because these cars are so heavily aero dependent. But also, he's braking on the inside where it's a little bit slippy, and it's also downhill into that corner. So as soon as you snatch the brake, that is it. You have got no way of slowing down. If it was, say, into turn 1 in COTA in Texas, it might be a different story, because it's steeply uphill. The natural resistance of the gradient might slow you down. But here, Bottas, once he snatched his brake, that was it. He was toast. And unfortunately, so was Lando. I'll touch on Lando in the driver ratings about how I think his race could have fared had Bottas not creamed into the back of him and instead missed him, perhaps. But Bottas knows it was his fault. It's one of those racing incidents. A 5-place grid penalty, some people are saying is lenient. I think that's bang on the money, because it's taken out 3 cars in the end. But it was an honest mistake. It wasn't like Valtteri did it on purpose. or was aiming to take out the Red Bulls. As much as Nico Rosberg was quite adamant that Bottas had just taken out the Red Bulls. It's one of those things. That's racing, and we need to remember that. These things happen. Made for a great race though, didn't it? Alright, so let's crack on with the driver ratings, and we will begin with the World Championship leader now, Lewis Hamilton. A stunning pole position lap, yet another pole position in Hungary, and why should we be surprised? He got away really well at the start and actually had a commanding lead. Had there not been a safety car or the subsequent red flag, he would have been in a fantastic position to pick up that 100th Grand Prix victory. Without Bottas skittling everyone, I think Verstappen would have been right on his tail, and we would have had a very, very interesting battle for the race win. But as it was, he recovered from essentially last after the restart to bag P3, which has actually become possibly P2, given the after-race disqualification of Sebastian Vettel. He leads the World Championship now, and if he'd said that heading into Silverstone, that heading into Spa, Lewis would be leading the World Championship, I'm sure he would have bit your hand off for that. But he displayed all of his qualities. The classic, my tyres are gone, and then suddenly he's going faster. His one-lap pace, his ability to overtake, his ability to go wheel-to-wheel with Fernando Alonso, and just his outright speed during the race, and to make a strategy work that was offset against everybody else on a track where overtaking is difficult, and he had to go and make up the time himself. Brilliant from Lewis. On another day, things would have gone very differently, and he would have sailed to a 100th Grand Prix victory from pole position. But as it was, I rate his performance as 4 stars. Let's move on to his teammate, Valtteri Bottas, and oh dear, Valtteri. It was a really poor start. Again, very similar to his start there last year. Then he misjudged his braking point and careered into Lando and wiped out 2 other drivers along with himself. 5th place grid penalty for Spa. Can't really complain with that. I think that's pretty fair. And I rate Valtteri's performance at half a star, even though he did qualify very well to get onto the front row. But that mistake was incredibly costly. Next we have Sergio Perez, and he was also taken out in the turn 1 melee, but he was kind of lucky actually to have been starting P4. He was a second off pole position, and that Red Bull wasn't a second slower than the Mercedes, even in Sergio's hands, so that was pretty poor from him. He did get kind of shafted because he was last out of the pit lane at the end of Q3 to make his second run, and he didn't then make the lights or the flag to get his lap in, but then should have done the lap the first time round. So very lucky to stay P4. Lots of work to do, I think, for Sergio, given the last 2 performances, if he wants to remain a Red Bull driver. But considering that, who else are they actually going to put in the car? I mean, they might steal Bottas, but would Bottas do a better job than Sergio? Perhaps. All in all, I rate Sergio's performance as 2 stars. And moving on to a very unhappy Max Verstappen. 1 point for him, actually 2 points after Sebastian Vettel's disqualification. And he was hit by Lando at turn 1, and his race kind of unravelled from there. The damage to his car, which was quite extensive actually to the floor, and the barge board being wiped off completely, prevented the car achieving anything better than 10th on the road. He should have really qualified on the front row. With that machine, he should have been ahead of Bottas. He should have been very, very close to what Hamilton could produce, and then maybe he would have been out of harm's way. Maybe he would have been ahead into turn 1. Who knows? Who knows? But at the end of that, considering what he had to drive with to the end of the race, I rate Max's performance as 3 stars. His qualifying performance letting him down somewhat. Charles Leclerc, he was another one of the victims on turn 1, not from Valtteri Bottas, but whacked into by Lance Stroll. qualified 7th, I believe, which I think the Ferrari was capable of a bit more. They just didn't quite get it together in qualifying, the Ferraris. So a very disappointing weekend for Charles. I rate his performance as 1.5 stars. Carlos Sainz, he crashed in Q2. Easy to do with the tyres overheating, and he got a massive gust of wind, but he didn't use that as an excuse. He just said it was, one of those things, and he was taking it on the chin. But the start went his way. He managed to keep himself out of trouble, and he went from P15 on the grid to 4th, I think, or 5th. So starting way back there, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. And he could have won the race had he not got stuck behind Nicholas Latifi after the restart. But P4 at the flag is a good rescue job and a potential actual promotion to 3rd place after Seb's disqualification. I rate Carlos's performance as 3.5 stars, simply because he kept himself out of trouble and drove brilliantly from there, and was also orchestrating the Ferrari strategy very well, convincing them to actually keep him out when he had some pace left in the tyres. Lando Norris, he was wiped out at turn 1, but he made an incredible start. Qualified 6th and was on the inside, and he got a really good launch. And this is the sort of launch that Valtteri should have been getting. Valtteri got a lot of wheel spin, but Sergio and Lando, directly behind him, both took off like rockets. Lando especially so, and he was heading for perhaps even 2nd place out of turn 1, definitely P3. And had he not been wiped out at the start, I think he could have won the race. But obviously he had to be involved in all the carnage for the chaos to unfold, so it was kind of a double-edged sword. He could have won the race had he avoided being hit by Bottas, but then he needed to disturb Bottas enough to make Bottas make the mistake. So, it's one of those things. His 15 race long points streak comes to an end. Qualified 6th, which was kind of par for McLaren this season. The car doesn't qualify so well, but it races much better. He would have done a great job in the race, I think, and probably pulled out a 5th place finish had all things been normal. So I rate Lando's performance as 2 stars. Lando's teammate Daniel Ricciardo, in a race of chaos, Daniel failed to score points. I think he has some damage to his car after his contact with Charles Leclerc at turn 1 as well. So it became a really difficult day for him as he still tries to get on top of the MCL 35M. Yeah, such a shame for Daniel that he couldn't capitalise on the chaos to pick up some really handy points, or maybe even a potential race win. Had he not been wiped out at the start and been pointing the wrong way, he would have been in a very strong position. I'm not sure if he'd have been able to make progress, but he would have been in contention for perhaps a top 5 finish. As it is, I rate Daniel's performance as 2 stars. Nicholas Latifi. So let's jump to Williams. I'm going to have to scroll down here a little bit. First points for Nicky, and what a brilliant race. It's his best finish. He ran as high as 3rd for much of the opening stint. Well done, Nicholas, and great reward for his improvements and efforts over the last few races. He didn't qualify all that well, but then nor did George, so he kind of didn't get shown up that badly, or he kind of put the car where it should be on the day, but he capitalised on the carnage ahead of him, kept his nose clean, came home in 8th place, which will become 7th after Seb's disqualification, and possible appeal depending on how that goes. But well done to Nicky. I rate his performance as 4 stars. George Russell has finally got points in a Williams. He's done it, and if you've seen it, you just saw how much it meant to him. The man was in tears. The emotion just got too much. It meant so much to him to give something back to the team, and he even offered to give himself up as like the sacrificial lamb for Latifi's race. That is the mark of the man that George is, and some people might see that as a weakness if he's going into a championship fight, but I would actually see it as a strength, because he has got such a good heart that he knows what's right. He knows what's wrong. He won't do something stupid, and he so deserves this moment. P9 on the road, P8 depending on Seb's disqualification. But whatever happens now, he has finally got points for Williams. It's just ironic that he was outscored by Latifi on the day. But I think perhaps this might be the floodgates opening, and when there's next a crazy race, George will be there to take advantage. And in fact, he even could have been way further up had the FIA not been so... Well, they were just enforcing the rules, to be honest, but he was smart. He spotted an opportunity to jump ahead of everyone. He came out of the pit lane second, and for a minute I thought George was going to be leading the race. Could you imagine if he'd held off, if that stayed legit and he'd held off Esteban and Sebastian? That would have been absolutely unbelievable. Hamilton would probably have caught them at the end had he got past Alonso, but for a minute there was a scenario where George Russell was about to win the Hungarian Grand Prix, but it wasn't to be. But P9 is fantastic, and I rate George's performance as 4 stars. Moving to Alfa Romeo, we're in a little bit of a jumbled up order. We're keeping a few drivers to the end to finish on a high note. Kimi Raikkonen, no score, caught in an unsafe release with Mazepin, so 1.5 stars for the Kimster. And for Antonio Giovinazzi, gambled at the start to come off the inters and go on to the slicks, didn't pay off, sped in the pit lane too, so a penalty apiece for the Alfa Romeos for speeding in the pit lane. That's kind of all your own fault, Antonio, so I rate your performance as just 1 star. Moving to AlphaTauri then, Pierre Gasly bagged P6 and the fastest lap. He did qualify P5, which was his best qualifying since Azerbaijan when he popped it onto the second row of the grid. Caught out at turn 1, had to run pretty much the entire way around the runoff. And he did well to recover from, I think he was 12th or something at the restart after they'd all come out of the pits, and to pick up a 6th place and the fastest lap point, which was important for AlphaTauri to do Red Bull a favour and steal that point away from Hamilton. I'm pretty sure that would have been a little text message from Dr. Marco to Franz Tost saying, get one of your boys on the softs and take that fastest lap point. I rate Pierre's performance as 3 stars. His teammate Yuki Tsunoda, well, he crashed in free practice 2, then he failed to get out of Q1, but he did rescue a P7 result, which is a good result for Yuki's confidence. I mean, there's all this talk about the tight scheduling that AlphaTauri have got him on to try and improve his temperament, but he's kind of a Takuma Sato character. If anyone's old enough to remember Taku in his early days when he was at Jordan and BAR and Honda, he was a bit of a wild driver. And if you listen to Gary Anderson on some of the race's podcasts, he's actually talked about how Taku was so adamant that he wanted an oversteery car that he couldn't see the light of needing an understeery car to just protect him a little bit. And I kind of get the feeling that Yuki is cut from a very similar cloth. I mean, we do like a good flamboyant Japanese driver in Formula 1, but if it's going to end up in the hedge more often than it finishes a race in the points, then there needs to be a balance struck. Yuki is a young driver. Let's remember that. There's a steep learning curve in Formula 1. We're seeing Mazepin go through the similar curve, but Mazepin, incredibly, has stopped crashing and spinning. Yuki, take a little bit of note of Nikita, because he's got to grips with things. I know he's driving a Haas and you're driving an AlphaTauri, but they're still F1 cars. So there's lots of room for improvement in the second half of the season for Yuki Tsunoda, and I rate his performance this weekend as 2.5 stars. Moving on to the green machines, I'm going to start with Lance Stroll. He wiped out against Charles Leclerc's side pod at turn 1, and a bit of a shame really, because they're conditions that Lance Stroll would have thrived in, and he would have been able to pull out maybe something really, really special, perhaps a podium or a very, very good points finish. As it was one corner, and that's your lot for Lance. So I rate his performance as 1 star. Sebastian Vettel, he came so close to victory, and had he actually nicked it, it would have been even more unfortunate that they weren't able to get the fuel out of his car at the end. He managed his way through turn 1 beautifully, having had a bit of a sticky start, and he applied as much pressure as he could to Esteban Ocon and made Esteban work for it. Slow stop really cost him the win, but even still, that outlap was sublime. That was the lap of a champion coming out of the pit lane, and Ocon and Alpine knew that they had enough buffer because of the slow stop, so they just went about their business, but they only just held on. So imagine if Seb had got it right, or if Aston Martin had got the pit stop right, there hadn't been that slight delay, we could have been looking at a green Aston Martin in first place and then being disqualified from first place, which would have been absolutely unbelievable. It would have just summed up the entire race. But yeah, a second place finish was miles better than Aston Martin could have hoped for heading into the weekend. So I rate Sebastian's performance as 4.5 stars despite being disqualified. The Haas boys, well, let's start with Nikita Mazepin. He qualified 19th, which was ahead of Mick Schumacher, who didn't run because he'd crashed in FP3, and his race was ended when Kimi Raikkonen came out of the pits. Came out of the pit box when he probably shouldn't have, really definitely shouldn't have, and that broke the right front steering arm, and the suspension was bent as well. So Mazepin didn't really get a chance to show what he could do in the pack. I mean, it could have been interesting with him racing against the likes of Verstappen and Hamilton and Ricciardo, because they would have put him under a lot of pressure, and it would have been good for him to learn about where to combat against the very, very best. And while we aren't all massive fans of Nikita, he's got his head down, he's getting on with the job, you don't hear him complaining, and you don't see him facing the wrong way as much anymore. I mean, he's driving a difficult car, but you know, credit where credit's due. He's driving that thing and doing something with it, doing more than I could with it. So credit to Nikita. Moving on to his teammate Mick Schumacher, he defended incredibly aggressively against Max Verstappen, and showed that he's not going to bow down to absolutely anybody at all in Formula 1. He did crash in FP3, which is disappointing, but he did bring the car home for a valuable race of experience. So I didn't rate Mazepin, did I? I missed that. So I rate Mazepin at 2 stars, and I rate Mick Schumacher's performance at 3 stars. And finally, we are at Alpine, the race winners. Let's start with Fernando Alonso. He drove and defended like a champion and like a lion. His defending won Esteban that race, really, because had Hamilton got past immediately, then he would have passed Sainz immediately, and he would have caught Seb immediately past him, and then Ocon would have just been crying because he knew what was coming. But 5th place in the end, even though his Fernando Alonso is a great result, considering that he probably wasn't really destined for anything better than a 7th or 8th had all things been normal this weekend. That's a really good result though for Fernando and for Alpine. So I rate Fernando's performance at 5 stars. Esteban Ocon, the race winner. Maiden Grand Prix victory from the Frenchman, and he thoroughly earned it. If you're going to be winning a Grand Prix, you want to be fending off a multiple world champion to do it. Even if that champion isn't in the machinery that he once was. But Esteban had fairly equal machinery with Seb, and he did the job. There was 2 moments where he could have lost it, and that was the pit stops, when Aston Martin went for the undercut, and when they came up against Kimi Raikkonen's Alfa Romeo to lap him, and Vettel tried to sneak by on the inside. But Ocon defended brilliantly, managed his tyres and the gap to Sebastian, held on for the victory, forgot to go into the pit lane, ran down the pit lane Jenson Button style, brilliant. A brilliant moment for Formula One. A brilliant moment for Esteban because he had that year out. He had a slow start to his 2020 season. He actually had a year and a half out considering COVID was around. So for him to have turned it around about a year later and be a race winner with Alpine is brilliant, brilliant, brilliant for him. So happy for him. And, if the 2022 regs do their job, we will see this more often because it will be a more even playing field and more drivers can get in on the act. And perhaps Esteban Ocon can show everyone exactly what he's capable of, like he did in Budapest this weekend, and maybe, just maybe, he could be world champion. I rate Esteban's performance as 5 stars. So there it is. There is my race recap, my thoughts on the Hungarian Grand Prix and my ratings for everybody this weekend. Unfortunately, we do now have to wait 3 whole weekends for the Belgian Grand Prix, but then F1 is back with a vengeance. I think there's 3 races in 3 weeks. I think we go Belgium, Holland, and then Monza. Can't wait. Brilliant. I mean, I'm going to be bringing out more content, even though it's the summer break. Look out for my 5 things that were great about the Hungarian Grand Prix and 5 things that sucked about the Hungarian Grand Prix. I'll be working on that this week. And when the 5 red lights go out, I will see you then. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to follow me on Instagram and on Twitter down below. Follow me on Twitch, which is over here, I think. And remember, kind is king. Have a great summer break, everybody. When the 5 red lights go out, I'll see you next time. Bye for now.